Good morning, Christ Hold Fast friends. My name is Bruce Hillman. I'm pastor of Hillside Lutheran Brethren Church in northern New Jersey and a contributor to Christ Hold Fast. Today is Thursday, and we are going to be in chapter 3, actually finishing it up in the book of Ecclesiastes. Well, when we started this kind of study through Ecclesiastes, I told you that this was a book that significantly dealt with issues of anxiety. And in fact it is, and we're going to talk about some of those issues in today's reading as well. One of the things that can create anxiety in our lives is when we think about the interplay between what we know on the one hand, things that we are certain of, and things we don't know or cannot know on the other hand. And so we're always kind of getting anxiety because we have to, we have things that we know and we're afraid of those things. We know those things are coming. And then there's things that we don't know, the what-ifs, and we're afraid of those things. And as we interplay between the things we know and we don't know, we can find that our anxiety gets steadily higher. If you've ever had the privilege of having a teacher or a mentor or somebody who is incredibly wise, one of the things that you'll know about them is that they know the limits of their knowledge. They, in a sense, know what they don't know, maybe even better than what they do know. Now, if you remember back to the early part of Ecclesiastes, we learned that to increase knowledge is to increase sorrow. Because as we increase knowledge, we learn more about what we don't know, how we don't have a comprehensive grasp of the universe, how we can't control things, than so much about what we do. Because so often we pursue knowledge thinking it'll give us gain, that it'll give us control, but it doesn't. Before I read the text this morning, I want to read you just a paragraph that I think makes an observation about this from a little work by Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr was a 20th century theologian. I don't particularly agree with a lot of his theological observations, but you may know him. He wrote the Serenity Prayer that's often said at AA and other things like that. And he was a very popular theologian and still quite famous. But in any case, in his book, The Nature and Destiny of Man, A Christian Interpretation, he makes this observation about anxiety and how it relates to knowledge. Listen to this. And he uses examples of a statesman, a politician, and a philosopher. He says, "The statesman is anxious about the order and security of the nation, but he cannot express this anxiety without an admixture of anxiety about his prestige as a ruler, and without assuming unduly that the only kind of order and security which he establishes is adequate for the nation's health. The philosopher is anxious to arrive at the truth, but he is also anxious to prove that his particular truth is the truth. He is never as completely in possession of the truth as he imagines. That may be the error of being ignorant about one's ignorance, but it is never simply that. The pretensions of final truth are always partly an effort to obscure a darkly felt consciousness of the limits of human knowledge. Man is afraid to face the problem of his limited knowledge, lest he fall into the abyss of meaninglessness." Does this sound maybe familiar? Thus fanaticism, we might call it fundamentalism, thus fanaticism is always a partially conscious, partially unconscious attempt to hide the fact of ignorance and to obscure the problem of skepticism. End of reading. What is Niebuhr saying there? He is saying that we are driven to find meaning, to find control, to find gain. But what we really find when we investigate and we're honest with ourselves, however much we know or can know, what stands always behind that is a much bigger cloud of darkness, hiddenness, meaninglessness that we can't probe, that we can't get in. And that fundamentally what it means for you and I is that we can't accept this. And so we sometimes believe we have more knowledge than we do, and we live confidently in the knowledge that we have, but sometimes the knowledge that we live confidently in actually isn't really knowledge about anything. In other words, we are afraid of meaninglessness, and it's surrounding us all around. Well, our good teacher today, Koheleth, from the book of Ecclesiastes, faces this agnostic crisis, the things that you can't know. And he mentors us through that. So let's read it. It's in Ecclesiastes 3. We're going to finish the chapter today, 16 through 22. And here is what it says. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward, and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? End of reading. There's so much about life that we want to know that we can't know. And not only is that just frustrating, but it leads to a high level of anxiety. It could lead to an existential crisis. Look at how the observations he makes, how he opens this up. He says, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. What's he getting at here? He's making the observation that isn't particularly profound, but that you and I know, is that the world isn't a completely an unjust place. And even if we look to the court system or the places where we're promised justice, we don't always find justice there. Instead, we look around and we see wickedness all over the place. And the question that we want answered is, well, why? And certainly we could say, well, people are sinners, but it goes deeper than that. We don't want to just hear that people are sinners. We want to know, well, why isn't God doing more about this? The chemical attack that happened in Syria a few days ago. Horrible, horrible. I don't know if you saw some of the footage from that. It was greatly disturbing to me to see that footage. And of children involved in this horrible chemical attack. And you go, man, why is this happening? Are we just supposed to say, well, people are evil and then that's just supposed to help us deal with it? Or are there greater depths to why is God permitting this? Why has this war been allowed to carry on for 6 years? Why is there a massive refugee crisis? Why? And we might have ideas on why that's the case, but we will never have a complete, comprehensive, this is the answer for that. And that, in a sense, can drive us to anxiety because the limits of our knowledge is something that we are, in fact, afraid of. I actually find it interesting that when I was growing up in the 80s, superheroes, comic books, those kind of things were a subculture. And now they're a mainstream thing. As you know, the first R movies for superheroes have come out, Logan being one. And I just saw yesterday on the news that Marvel and DC are going to be making more R-rated superhero movies, which just shows the extent to which they've now become mainstream. And I don't want to make too much out of this, but I do think it's interesting that as the culture has moved more postmodern and left kind of its modernist structure of Judeo-Christian values and things like that, and it's moved into a higher diversity, a more type of relativistic sort of way of looking at things, dealing more with truth as identity instead of truth as objective, that the superhero genre has become very popular. Because what is the superhero genre really doing? It's giving us this idea of a hero who's going to come in and make things right. But what I find interesting about the superhero genre and the hero who makes things right is that the hero has to have special powers. They have to be somebody who isn't like us. Because the problems that you and I face, apparently, we can't fix them. There's a kind of nihilistic pessimism that sits behind these superhero stories about what we think of our culture and what we think about how we need to be saved and how we need to be rescued. And it takes a power or a force that is supernatural or mutant or some other thing that's going to come in and is going to save the day, because obviously we're not capable of saving ourselves. I don't know, maybe that's reading too much into it, but I think it is an interesting way to critique the culture, because the culture is just very in tune with the fact that it's broken, and it doesn't really have the answers on how to fix it. Now, you'll notice something in this passage that might be disturbing for some people, which is there's passages in the Bible that seem to be agnostic about what happens after you die. And that is the case here. He says, verse 19, "For what happens to the children of man, and what happens to the beasts is the same. As the one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts. For all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward, and the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth?" Koheleth, the writer of Ecclesiastes, is agnostic as far as what happens to us when we die. And he says that in a way, death is God's way of testing us. He uses that language of testing. He says, you're no better than the beasts. And this is the way God's testing us. He's testing us to remind us that we think, we have our brains and we stand upright and we're these great creatures and we're so much better than the animals. And Koheleth wants to say, do you know that? Are you that much better than them? Fundamentally, your lot, your end is the same as theirs. They're made of material stuff, you're made of material stuff. They're going to die, you're going to die. So again, even though we can claim to be smarter than the animals and we have our thumbs and we can do all these things and make tools and all this sorts of stuff, death stands in our way and is the final totalizer of all things. So you go, well, this is weird. Why in the Bible do we have a guy who seems to be agnostic about what happens after we die? Actually, this was a significant question that exists for much of the Bible's history. Even when you get up into Jesus' day, you have two significant parties who disagree on this question. You have the Pharisees and you have the Sadducees. The Pharisees are the populist group. They're kind of with the poor people, and the Sadducees are the more elite group. And they have lots of differences, and there's a lot of diversity actually in what Pharisees believe. But just as a broad base, Pharisees in Jesus' day believed in the resurrection of the dead, although they disagreed sometimes between themselves what that meant. And the Sadducees did not believe that. They believed that when you died, that was it. So even into Jesus' day, this is a question that's being debated about what happens when you die. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because you can't have knowledge of that. See, that's what he's pointing out for us. You can't peer beyond that darkness and say, well, this is what happens. But of course, we know something that Koheleth doesn't know. We know something that the Pharisees of Jesus' day, at least in his early days, also didn't know. We know someone who has gone into that veil of darkness, into that place of death, and has come back, and has resurrected, and has told us what is there. And Paul says, we see through a glass darkly. We don't have crystal clear vision. There's still a lot of things unknown, but we do have some vision. And what we can know is that Jesus says that he goes and he prepares a place for us. A place where we can join him, a place where we can be. So the darkness of death, which stands as a totalizing force of unknowingness, hiddenness for all of human history, has been broken by Jesus. And Jesus shows us a way through death to another side of life. And I need to just, I think, make an important point here. There is a mistake that's often made that people think that when you die, you just cross into like another realm, into another world. And that's like where dead people go. So dead people have their own existence and living people have their own existence. And there's two types of existences. And that's not really the Christian version. You don't enter into another dimension. You pass through death to life. And that's what the resurrection says. As the Creed says, I believe in the resurrection of the body, that one day the body will be resurrected and we will pass through death and have life again. And this is something that Jesus shows us the way to. So, we know that. Koheleth doesn't know that. But even with his not knowing, he does know something. And it's something he's been pressing the whole time. And here's what it is. And you've heard it before. He likes to repeat himself. But what does he say? He says, so I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. For who can bring him to see what will be after him? There is nothing better than for someone to enjoy his lot, what has been given to him. This is the theme we've heard over and over again. Be aware of the present. Be aware of what God is giving you today. Everything you have today is gift. Your act of worship is to simply receive those gifts and to rejoice in them. Life is not to be lived trying to figure out the unknown. You don't know what tomorrow will bring. And you're just going to get anxious if you try to figure out what tomorrow will bring. And even if you say, well, I think tomorrow will be like this, and then tomorrow actually turns out to be like this, it wasn't because you actually knew what tomorrow would bring. It was simply because your guess happened to match up with what happened. But you can't know what tomorrow will bring. So all you have today are God's promises for tomorrow, because that's the only thing you can have assurance of for the future. And instead, in our day today, we receive daily bread and we give thanks for it. I'll close with this thought, which is a way that Paul makes sense of this, the Apostle Paul, in the New Testament. And Paul calls the present, and Paul can be a pessimist, let's be honest. Paul calls the present this present evil age. And he calls the life to come through the other side of death the age to come. And he says we hope in the age to come as we live in this present evil age. Now what's he doing there? What he's saying is, I have a promise of a future hope in the age to come. And that hope, which hasn't happened for us yet, we're not there yet, is received in the present evil age. In today, this present evil age of today, I live with the knowledge of the age to come. And that situates my present with 1 foot in the future and 1 foot in the present, if that makes sense. So I can only be in the present, but I can kind of tip my toe into that present future, into that age to come. And that helps situate what I am going to make sense of life and things today. So whatever's happening to me today, or whatever will happen to me today, it's not just live in the moment and just that's it. It's live in the moment but not for the moment. It's living in the moment in the reality of the life to come, which is just another way of Paul saying, look, you have God's promises today, and they should change the way you live today. They should affect you. When you feel your fears pressing in, you have to go to God's word, and you have to hear what God says about what he will do for you, so that you can fully take in the day that God has given, because you don't know if today will be your last day. So to live a life of worship and to live a life that is fully able to actualize the giftedness that it receives, one looks to God's promises and applies them into the present moment. But as soon as you move from that to trying to control the future, to manipulate, to get a certain outcome, your anxiety is going to go up, because you can't know that. You can't know what tomorrow brings except for what God has promised you that it will bring. And that's the point today. The kind of certainty of assurance that you can have in God's promises, and the vast amount of unknowing that you and I have, because we simply can't know so many things. And so I leave you with that, and I leave you with, again, this reminder that I feel like I'm a record that's just repeating itself, but the book of Ecclesiastes does that. Live in the promises of God in this present moment. They are your life. They are your hope, and they will help you actualize the most out of the day that you have today. So blessings to you, friends. I hope you have a wonderful day. And as we enter into Holy Week early next week, let us be in prayer and thanksgiving for all that God has done for us. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.